Hello everyone, my name's Angus Campbell and I'm sat here today in my man cave with three examples of two motorcycle models that were due to be put into production in 1971. These models being the Triumph Bandit and the BSA Fury. The interesting point is that neither model ever made it into production, and therefore what I'd like to do is provide a brief history of the models and also tell you about these three surviving examples and what links them together. So I hope that sets the scene and I hope you enjoy. By the late 1960s, there were many traditional British motorcycle manufacturers still producing motorcycles whose origins lay from designs in the 1930s. And at the same time there were new entrants arriving into the market from the Far East, namely from Japan, led by the manufacturer Honda. BSA and Triumph both used to export the vast majority of their output to the North American market, and for that they achieved the Queen's Award for Industry 2 years running in the late 1960s. However, the new imposters from Japan were eating into that market and taking market share. And so, with influence from the American importers, BSA and Triumph decided that they needed to bring a new, fresh model to the marketplace that stripped itself of any previous design traits usually associated with the good old-fashioned British pushrod parallel twin. And so it was decided to design a new model of 350cc capacity double overhead cam, and the reason for that being that this machine capacity fitted in with the licensing and insurance laws in North America, which was the biggest market for BSA and Triumph, even though it didn't necessarily fit in with the local licensing laws in the UK at the time, which limited learners to a capacity of 250cc. Anyway, the die was set. They needed new models to challenge the Japanese and to stave off them taking more market share. And so what they decided to do was to commission an external designer to come up with that model and to produce the first prototype. And the name of that designer was Edward Turner. Edward Turner began designing motorcycles in the 1920s before he actually joined the automotive industry, and it was one of his designs that he ultimately showed to Ariel that was adopted, and when he joined Ariel, and that was the Ariel Square 4, the original overhead cam 600cc model. In 1932 Ariel went bust, but Jack Sangster bought Ariel and installed Turner as his chief designer. In 1936, Ariel owner Jack Sangster bought Triumph, and he then installed Edward Turner as Triumph's general manager and chief designer. Is best known for, as at the time he designed the Triumph Speed Twin in 1938 that became the basis of many parallel twin designs both within Triumph and other manufacturing companies. He continued at Triumph when Triumph was acquired by BSA in 1951, and in fact ultimately Turner became a member of the BSA board in the early 60s, but ultimately he retired from BSA Triumph around about 1966, I believe, and he then continued designing under his own freelance design company, and it's in this capacity that he was commissioned to design what became the BSA Fury and Triumph Bandit. Turner was given some space at the BSA Redditch factory and assembled a small team of engineers, and in 1968 produced this first prototype, which at the time I think was slated to be called the Triumph Toledo. In addition to the new engine, the prototype also featured novel designs regarding external fork springs and also a cable operated disc front brake. The engine featured double overhead cams driven by an idler gear, which itself was driven by, as you can see, this chain from the crank. It had a 180-degree crank and I believe a 5-speed gearbox. This is the bike as completed then, and here it is as it is now, where it resides at the National Motorcycle Museum near Birmingham. This prototype was then delivered to BSA Triumph, and it was then assessed by a team working under the auspices of the two main designers at the time, Doug Heel and Bert Hopwood. The bike was tested and put through its paces, and although it showed a lot of promise, unfortunately the engine was found to be very fragile, and there were a number of other issues found as well, such as the disc brake tending to grab, and it was thought also that the rolling chassis wasn't sturdy enough for a bike of its potential performance characteristics. So this left Doug Heel and Bert Hopwood with a bit of a dilemma. Should they recommend the bike be adopted or not? Following the tests and assessment of the prototype, Doug Heel and Bert Hopwood were persuaded to accept the design as a foundation for a new model, but this was on the understanding that there would need to be extensive redesign of most of the components, and this they began in earnest in 1968. I'm not going to go into any detail regarding that redesign and development phase, but suffice to say that that information is covered in depth in 3 excellent books, 2 by Brad Jones and 1 by Mick Duckworth, covering the period from both a BSA and Triumph perspective. So the first prototype Triumph Toledo became the pre-production Triumph Bandit and the pre-production BSA Fury. So it's obvious that from these images that the revised designs were radically different to Turner's original, and although the bikes used some of the common rolling chassis parts, such as the wheels and forks, there was a totally new frame, and also, as you can see, the motor design had been revised significantly to try and resolve some of the inadequacies of the original design. An example of this is the crankshaft, which, as you can see here, went through a number of iterative designs to improve primarily its strength at high revolutions, because this motor was designed to rev up to 9.5, potentially 10,000 RPM. So after 2 years of redesign and development over 69 and 70, arrangements were made for the model to be included in the November 1970 launch of the 1971 power set range. So everything appeared to be going smoothly and the stage appeared to have been set. So the BSA Fury looked to be all set to be included in the 1971 BSA range, and arrangements were made for the UK press and worldwide launch of the range at the Royal Lancaster Hotel in London on the 10th of November 1971, and 2 days later in North America at La Quinta Hotel in Palm Springs in California. And an example of the Fury was included in the UK launch, and an example of a Triumph Bandit SS was included in the US launch. And this bike behind me, this Fury Roadster, was the actual model that was included in the UK launch. The Royal Lancaster Hotel as the venue for the UK launch was a relatively new hotel at the time. It was built in the 1960s and therefore was still very new in November 1970, and still looks very, very similar today as it did in the 60s and at the time of the launch. There were several dealer meetings and photo shoots arranged for during the day on November the 10th, but the main launch was over a dinner that evening, where following dinner each of the bikes were unveiled, and that was then followed by a stint by the comedian Dave Allen. A film and various photos and documentation does exist that capture the event, and these are 3 stills taken from the film of the last bike to be unveiled, which was the BSA Fury, and this is the actual bike that is the BSA Fury Roadster that's currently in my possession. This is a better shot from a little further away that shows the BSA Fury in the centre that's just been unveiled and within its pod, and several other bikes that had been unveiled prior to that, the 2 at the front being an example, I think, of Triumph and BSA triples. At the time, there were 3 models that were frequently contracted to assist with the publicity of the new models and with brochures, etc. And these models were Carol Cleveland, Karen Gardner and Karen Young. Here we see a photo of Carol Cleveland in front of the BSA Fury following its launch at the show. However, normally Carol is associated with the publicity pictures associated with the Triumph Bandit, which we'll see in a moment. I've not seen any other examples where this photo was used for publicity purposes other than this document here, which has only recently come to my attention. But the most well-known publicity photo is this one here, again of my Fury taken with Karen Young, in allegedly taken in a wood somewhere in Warwickshire, and I don't know if this was taken before or after the launch, but it's pretty obvious that it is in the autumn with all the leaves on the ground. And suddenly here's another one with Karen Young, and allegedly this is Stephen Metham sat on the bike, and Stephen was the chief stylist, but I can't confirm that, and certainly with certain other photos of the period there's someone wearing the same jacket, but I'm pretty sure that's not Stephen Metham when we can see his face. Here's a better known photo from a series of the Triumph Bandit taken with Carol Cleveland in the background, and also with Tony Lomas, who was one of the factory test riders and who spent a lot of time on in the seat or on the seat of Bandits and Furies. So these are the photos that were used in the press and publications to promote the models at the time. But let's now have a look at some of the brochures and other material that was produced to be distributed by the dealers. So the 1971 power set range was officially launched in November 1970, and this began in the UK primarily on the evening of November the 10th at the Royal Lancaster Hotel for an evening event. Prior to that there was a smaller dealer event, and then 2 days later on November the 12th a similar, more lavish launch occurred in North America, in Palm Springs, where there was a 4-day event. At both events there was quite a large selection of models to represent the range. At the Royal Lancaster event in the UK there was an example of a BSA Fury without any engine internals, and that's the roadster that I now own, that came to me via Vale Onslow's. And similarly at the Palm Springs event in North America, in the US, there was a Triumph Bandit SS represented there, which again had no engine internals, and in fact at the US event many of the models were available for the press and dealers to actually ride, with a selection of the contracted racers such as Jim Rice, who were present as well at the time. Within the UK, the press did get to obviously view all the models and potentially sit on them, but certainly there was no opportunity to ride them at the time. So at each event, one of the first things that the dealers were presented with was this merchandising guide with a whole raft of other publicity material, notably photographs and line drawings of each of the models. This all this material and all this preparation and the launches, etc., must have cost an awful lot of money. But they really were pushing the boat out to try and grab the attention, and the fact that they were trying to launch both brand new models in the shape of the Fury, but also significantly revamped models in the shape of the oil-in-frame twins, 650 twins, Lightning Thunderbolt 5-bill Scrambler. We had the new B50 Victor oil-in-frame. We had a revamped Starfire that came out as the Gold Star, and also had the revamped, more American-styled Mark II Rocket 3. So anyway, most of these are represented initially in this merchandising guide, which not only provided examples of brochures and suggestions for advertising campaigns, but also information relating to how dealers might want to engage with the radio for advertising slots and television as well. So there's the first page is an opportunity for the dealers to either rent or buy a film strip set, and this is for them probably to display in their showrooms. There's one or two pieces missing in this folder. Ad reprints seems to be missing, although there's one or two later. There's a script for a dealer radio spot. There's headers and suggestions of images for television spots, for television advertising, and also then examples of templates for magazine and publication advertising. So here's the example of the British are Coming type ads for the trail stroke off-ride bikes like the B50 and the B25. Then we've got the twins here. So this is an example of what looks like a Firebird Scrambler, and actually that's an image we might want to try and recreate when my A70s on the road reliably, which is hopefully short-lived. And then they go into quite a lot of examples of and suggestions of how to display the bikes and where to place posters, etc. There were a number of posters printed, and you can see one or two examples of those in Brad Jones' book, but I've never seen any copy of those in the flesh. There is one style poster in the back of this merchandising guide, so I'll show you that shortly. So several pages of what they called, I think, floor planning is what they officially called it, I think. Then we go into details of what BSA had scheduled for national advertising. This is an American copy of this folder, so it's travelled a bit in its life, but here we can see that they have advertising slots and content booked for some of the major publications such as Cycle Guide and Cycle World. And then we go into these images, either photographs or line drawings of each of the models, except for the Aerial 3 and the Bantam, and those two were still included within the power set range, but weren't publicised so well. I don't think there was an example of a Bantam at the UK launch, but certainly there was an Aerial 3. And we'll talk a little bit more about these images shortly. But it's nice just to have a full set. You can see plenty of them available as singles, etc., through the usual websites, but not usually as a full set. And then we go into the official brochures. In this case for the US, and we'll have a little look at those in more detail in a moment. And then, as I say, finally, in the back of this folder, there's the Aerial 3, what appears to be a brochure, but actually it's a folded poster, and the iconic one. The Aerial 3 had been was already being manufactured because it was launched earlier in the year in 1970, and by the time of the official launch of the 71 range, I think they'd built most of that the year's schedule or the season schedule, and this folds out into quite an impressive poster with some iconic images. Again, I've seen images of one or two of these in books, but never one in the flesh before I got this. Before I was lucky enough to come across this merchandising guide, so that's quite nice. So there are plenty of these knocking about. Let's have a bit more in-depth look at some of the brochures. So the first one is the one most people know, with the iconic image of the US Rocket 3 on the front, advertising the power set. There's the Firebird Scrambler image that we might want to try and recreate at some point. But the key thing for us is the fact that centre spread are the examples of the Fury E35R Roadster and the E35 SS Street Scrambler, and the remaining models are in here as well. Quite an impressive colour brochure, but we do know that a lot of these images were based upon pre-production machines, certainly in the case of the Fury, and a lot of them were touched up as well. So for instance, the Rocket 3 image on the back here, we know that the brake arms on the front brake are an early version because the production ones didn't look like that. But also, originally it was intended that this bike be in white rather than red, and in fact there's some evidence that this is a photo of one of the white bikes where the red has been painted in. But a nice brochure nevertheless. The UK example is this one, which unfolds to be a poster again, and you can see again the Fury is pretty much centre spread with the largest photo. It's not, as some people have said, it's not very inspiring because the photos aren't in colour, it's all black and white. Now, just to mention that the Triumph division was also doing exactly the same thing, so they produced a similar full colour brochure of the models in their range, and again centre spread is a double page of the Bandit SS, and the following page single page of the Roadster for the Bandit. And they also produced an exact same style UK brochure, and the Bandits in this case were on the outside rather than in the centre, because they decided to reserve a couple of the sides for photographs of some of the features of the machine, so the conical hub, twin leading shoe, switches, megaphones, front forks, and obviously the one of the oil bearing frames, in this case B25, B50. So going back to some of the photos in the merchandising guide, then in the case of, for instance, the Fury SS, we know that's predominantly a line drawing, and that's because I was lucky enough at one point to purchase some proofs. Now, I don't know where these originated, but this is a copy of the same line drawing. For some reason, the badges and the legend have been scored out. It's mounted on a sheet of paper which states front perspective view, and then there's a note here which basically states that this wasn't completed since no machines were available to photograph for the further views required. So that tells a story in its own right, really. The fact that at the launch there were few, if any, models available, and certainly in the UK the one that was available, i.e. the Fury Roadster that I have now have, wasn't a runner and had no engine internals, although obviously that wasn't publicised at the time at the launch, because to all intents and purposes from external appearances it was complete. And then we have some other publicity photos, the most well known being those with the model Karen Young. You've already seen earlier in the documentary an image of her leaning over my Fury, which is the iconic image that most people remember, but there are one or two others as well, including this one. And this is an actual photograph, and again it has some information on the back, and this information seems to pertain to a brief description of the bike that was to accompany this photo, presumably for again for publications. And I have seen this in one or two books and publications as well, and I'm pretty sure this is again my Fury that was borrowed either before or after the UK launch on November the 10th. I've got a feeling it was after, because the bike was only built a few days before that launch. I think the records indicate that it was built round about the 6th of November. So they seem to be on a pretty tight timeline. And then one other photo that I've never seen before is this one. I came across this one on one of the usual auction sites, and I don't know of the origins of this particular example, or even if it exists now. It's not my bike, and there are various details on the bike that allow me to identify as such. One of them being the fact that on the side panel here, the lower third of the side panel oil tank were in dove grey, similar to the frame, but in this one it's difficult to discern, but it looks as though it's in black, i.e. 72 model range, so this might be a little later example, probably of a road-going prototype for testing purposes, although pretty much in the what was expected to be the exact colours of the for 1971. And then finally, oh, here's another example, just a blown up one of the Roadster, but these are good for obviously looking at some of the details when examining these, or restoring, rebuilding, or whatever, for those people that have gone down that route like myself. Triumph did the same for the Bandit, although in that dealer merchandising guide there are no examples of the Triumph range in that. It's purely branded as a BSA event, but the more well-known photos and those that are pretty readily available are from a set that were taken in front of Umberslade Hall, the Research and Development Centre, with Carol Cleveland, who's the model on this example, this Bandit SS, and the dummy photographer there is Tony Lomas, who was one of the experimental tester riders who put some miles on these bikes with others such as Percy Tate and Martin Russell. And this example of a Bandit SS is useful because that's a good view of the high-level exhaust system, because I've never seen an original set, and what we have at the moment on Tony Page's Bandit SS is one from the factory, but it's not the ultimate production one, so it's a good view this to try and replicate, the shape, certainly the external shape of the high-level exhausts. And this one looks as though it probably was a test bike on the road, because it's registered, and you can clearly see that. So there we are. That concludes this section, as those are the examples of the publicity material. So you can see BSA was spending an awful lot of money marketing these bikes, both from the point of view of the publications, the brochures, and the lavish events at which they were launched, and this did enable them to get a wide press across the globe. However, did it mean that they were necessarily ready for production to allow the bikes to be shipped across to North America, its main market? Well, let's find out. So following the launch, BSA then turned their attention to promoting the model, but also having to attend then to arrangements and continuing work to get the bike into production. And this not only entailed building pre-production prototypes for continuing testing, but also in the development and publication of all the associated materials, such as handbooks and parts books. So there was still plenty to do, and time was marching on now well into 1971, and the year during which they were hoping to see a return on this investment. So marching into 1971, and work continued to both publicise the models and to continue testing them towards full production. And there were certainly couple of scheduled production dates that were tentatively penciled into the Small Heath production schedule, which obviously initially never materialised. So it was obvious that there was still some work to do to ensure that the build quality and ultimate running quality of the bike was sufficient, and an initial batch of, we believe, up to 20 examples were built probably around about February, I think, February 1971, for extensive testing and also for assembly quality, and ultimately the QC failed. So there were a number of items and faults to remedy before they could begin full production. However, in the meantime, as I said, the publicity continued, and also there were some significant road tests published. In this copy of the American Cycle Guide in March 1971, this is probably the most well known, with the Bandit Roadster on the front. But there's, say, an extensive article. I think I'm trying to remember who wrote these. One of them was the influential Bob Green, and I can't remember if it's this magazine or another magazine that he represented. Oh, it's the other one. So we'll come on to that in a second. But you can see a multi-page extensive spread with photos of American representatives of the publications being in the UK in what appears to be a pretty gloomy winter scene here, with several examples, one of which is a Fury SS on the road. And on the right there you can see again Tony Lomas, who was accompanying them on this trip. The visitors also had the opportunity to test, I believe, a Triumph at Mira, which I think went okay, and I think luckily, although there was a problem, I think, with the points with one of the bikes, which actually was quite a common problem at the time, luckily, because of the weather, they had to abort that event anyway. But the visitors came away with a reasonable impression of the bike, even though it played up a bit, and even though the weather was atrocious. So that's quite a well-known edition of Cycle Guide from March 1971. And in addition to that, there's the influential Bob Green, editor of Motorcycle Sport Quarterly, who also did an extensive feature. And you can see on the front cover here, there's an image of a motor which appears to have been prepared especially for this, as it appears to either have black painted covers, such as the cam chain cover here and the rocker covers, and also the engine barrel fins seem to have been blacked as well. But we don't know whether these were just this was an image that was just touched up, or whether there was an example of an engine with these areas blacked in. But you can see there are one or two things that wouldn't have been included on the production machines, and that's obviously the bell mouse on the carbs. But also on this example as well, what I've noticed is there's a blanking plug where there should be the spindle for the gear change quadrant, and that means then that there's certainly no gearbox in this, and if this is one of the experimental engines, which it might have been, then those didn't have gearboxes. They were purely for testing the running of the engine from the point of view of the crank pistons and valve gear, etc. Anyway, let me there we are, and there we are, and this was written by Bob Green himself, the editor, who visited the factory and was courted by Doug Heel at the time, and also present. Funny enough, there's a similar photo of the one that we saw in the cycle guide, but that's a better photo of the Fury SS, which I don't think exists anymore, BAC 35J. And there again, but again, good photos to enable you to replicate any parts. And that must be it too, as part of the introductory photo. But yeah, quite an extensive article and a follow-up as well with respect to a technical article where the great Phil Vincent himself visited the factory and interviewed Doug Heel, and here you can see Phil Vincent at one of the engine cells at Umberslade with a Fury being put through its paces. So very extensive articles with not just publicity material but also a lot of technical information, as you can see here from these photos of the individual engine parts. So useful article. And what I'll also just show you, I don't think it's in this example, but back to cycle guide, I think there's an example in here. Here we are. Yeah, you can see what they did within this edition is reproduce the full brochures for both Triumph and I believe BSA. The power set. Yeah, there we are. The power set one is in here too. So these were distributed and bound into every copy. So you can see the lengths they were going to push the range that year. It was going to be a big year. Now also as well in preparation for production, they did produce some publications, one of which is a parts list, but you can see this was published for 1972, so this would have been a little bit later on in 71. This is an original example. There aren't too many about, and we think this is probably a final printing proof version, because all the original copies we know of have been printed internally on this rather strange rough blue paper, matte paper. So that seems to indicate to me that they weren't quite ready to go, and that these aren't final publications. So these would have been done fairly early on in 71. In addition, the company continued to write and publish other technical information for both the 1971 range in general, but also including the Fury. This data book for dealers was printed in January 1971, and this includes both the Ariel 3, K2 and the Furies. So you can see everything was being geared up. But then what I also came across a few years ago is this, which originally a number of us thought was never published, and then I managed to get a couple of copies of it, and this is the actual owner's handbook for the Fury. And this contains a whole mine of information which is invaluable, because it includes, for instance, information on valve timing, without which it would be very difficult to ensure that any motor was set up correctly and tuned correctly. So of course I can't find it now, but let me just give me a second. Here we are. That's obviously for the chain. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. So information about how the valve timing marks should line up on the 3 sprockets. So invaluable information. In addition, BSA were attending several shows. So there was an Olympia show, Kensington Olympia show in early '71, at which I think it was my bike again that was there with, and this time Karen Gardner was the model, assisting with the publicity of that machine. So it would appear that everything was ramping up for production, but there were problems, because firstly, in order for the company to get a return on its investment within the 1971 model year, it should have really been shipping these models out to its main market, North America, before Christmas in 1970. And here we were, probably in February, March time, where they were building, I think, the B-25 SS Gold Stars, etc. They were coming off the production line in January '71, as were the A-75 Rocket 3s. They hadn't yet started producing the B-50s, and in fact there was still no set schedule to begin production of the Fury. But at the time, we know from testers' notes that 1 or 2 people had managed to secure from original factory personnel that engine testing and road testing still continued, but again with niggly faults being present, and therefore this just started to add to the delays. And if we go back to the example of the parts list, then again, all of a sudden we get some indication that things weren't very good, because firstly, this is for '72, not for '71, and secondly, the publication date of this, I think, is, it's August. I think it's August '71, and similarly the owner's handbook is August '71. So these publications were for the '72 model year, and in fact that ties in with the fact that there was an announcement sort of mid-year where it was stated that the Fury would still be available, but not until '72 model year. So all of a sudden you began to see some significant cracks, and ultimately what happened was that, unfortunately, due to the significant investment in trying to get the power set to market, it was so late that it actually missed the large buying season in North America, and ultimately that led to a downhill path whereby redundancies were announced sort of towards the beginning of the second half of the year. The main ones just after, I think, that they'd finalised details for the '72 model year, which at that time still included the Fury, and ultimately the factory got into severe financial difficulties, to an extent where shortly after there was a board decision to conclude that the Fury project wouldn't be continued. It was never publicly announced, and they just said it wouldn't be available. And internally, I think it was officially shelved, pending better times. But we do know that the development of the motor at Ummersley continued until October-November before it was stopped. And then ultimately, circumstances at the factory with respect to finances, with respect to all the initiative to try and save it through 1972 never came to fruition, and ultimately MVT was formed and the BSA name died. So with the demise of the BSA group throughout 1972 and ultimately in 73, then although some elements of the industry were salvaged with the formation of Norton Villiers Triumph, unfortunately the time was up for the Fury and the Bandit, and those models were no longer developed and taken forward into production. However, during the liquidation of some of the group's assets, a number of examples did make it out of the factory with interested parties, in addition to a hoard of certain spare parts that had been bought in preparation for full production. And that's how actually the two models have lived on in certain circles and have led to these examples still being in existence today. With the demise of the Fury and Bandit and ultimately BSA itself, a lot of the pre-production parts and some of the complete examples were scrapped, but some models were still out in the market, and also some spares were bought up as part of the job lots that were sold off by the liquidators. I think it was Cooper's Lybrand at the time, to other retailers. I think MCE and Bob Joyner Motorcycles, as it was at the time, bought up batches, and also obviously Alan Clues, who went on to use the B50 as a basis for CCM initial models. But apparently I think at the time the batch that he bought included some Fury stock, which I think he ultimately sold on. In addition to that, there were some models such as this one being shown now that were still out in the marketplace, with BSA distributing some of these around the world for publicity purposes post the launch. And this is actually my show Fury as it was when it was at Vale Onslow in Birmingham, because following the launch and following a number of other shows that this bike attended, it ended up in the showroom of Vale Onslow's. On the 29th of November 1978, Motorcycle News published an article about the Fury at Vale Onslow, and here you can see a copy of that article. The bike ultimately actually stayed with Vale Onslow for 20 years or so, until I purchased it in 1991. And you can see here an image of the bike outside Vale Onslow, and at the time the article stated that they would be interested in selling the machine for, I think, at about £2,000, which at the time was quite a lot of money. And I think they had so many inquiries about it that they ultimately decided to keep it, and certainly one of the inquiries was from me at the time. During the mid to late 70s, adverts such as this appeared, and in several publications around the world, and these were posted by one Tony Page, who was very keen on trying to secure enough parts to build a Bandit or a Fury from scratch, or even if possible to purchase an entire machine. And these adverts were run for I think a fairly lengthy spell, and did ultimately allow Tony to secure enough parts to begin building a machine, as well as ultimately being in the position where a machine that actually got out of the factory and a runner was actually offered to him as well. The newly created Norton Villiers Triumph concern also experimented with the Bandit Fury rolling chassis in the mid-70s with potential new models, and here you can see a P92 project, which is a B50 engine in a Bandit rolling chassis. And although I think one or two examples were made and still exist, these never went into production. So we knew that some examples of the models had survived, and also we knew that there were a lot of parts that eventually made it out of the factory, and those parts were, we think, predominantly stocked up for the first pre-production pilot build of the Fury and Bandit, which ultimately never happened. But these were now distributed across several retailers in the UK. But having said that, there were people like myself and Tony Page that were very keen to try and create running examples of these machines, which we were both very interested in. So back to this photo of my show Fury when it was at Vale Onslow's. This was taken in either 1990 or 1991 by a friend of mine who belonged to the same classic motorcycle club as myself, and that was because he was writing a book at the time entitled BSA: The Complete Story, and that friend was Owen Wright. And Owen had gone over to Vale Onslow to get a photo of the bike because he wanted to include it in his book, which he duly did. And this rekindled my interest in that bike, having tried to secure it 15 or so years before with Peter Vale Onslow. And what I did then in 1992 was I visited Vale Onslow's to take some photos myself, and started talking to Peter Vale Onslow, and to cut a long story short, we concluded a deal, and I purchased the bike, knowing that this was a show model with obviously an interesting history and pretty good provenance, but that it had no engine internals and that and didn't run. And this is a digitised photo of it at the time, shortly after I brought it home, where it's in what was my back garden then. Superficially, it looked fine. It was covered in a lot of dust, as you can see on the electrical tray here. That should be dove grey, but it appears to be dark grey, charcoal. Also, the side stand lug on the frame was damaged, so that needed a slight repair, hence the bike there being on the main stand. So the grand master plan was to try and find the parts to complete the build on this motor and get it running, in the same way that Tony Page was attempting to do the same thing with a build from scratch himself, which he began in the mid-70s. And so what I did following acquisition of the bike was take it to a number of shows to publicise it, and also I was invited to display it at the 1993 BSA 3 rally, where it was displayed alongside Tony Page's bike at the time, because he did manage to ultimately acquire a running BSA Fury from another associate in the circle. In addition to that, as this photo shows as well, it was publicised in a 1994 copy of British Bike magazine, following it being displayed at BSA there, with a request for anyone being able to provide any parts to help me out. But actually, ultimately, nothing really came of that. However, at that BSA, or one in a couple of years after it, myself and Tony Page did meet another aficionado of the BSA Fury, whom himself had collected a whole stash of parts from the early 70s, and was intending himself to build those parts up into a running Fury. And although we did communicate and meet up with him on a number of occasions, ultimately I was notified probably around about 2000, 2001 that he was advertising those parts for sale, and I was lucky enough to be able to contact him before they were sold, and go to his home to view the parts which he'd stored in his loft, and then to actually purchase them and bring them back to my home to join the show Fury that was still there at the time. So it was now about year 2001. I had the show Fury from Vale Onslow, plus a separate stash of parts of almost a complete bike that I could build up. Tony Page had a running BSA Fury, and also from a stash of parts that he ultimately collected, he was beginning to build a Triumph Bandit. At this point, I was beginning to try and plan a build and sorting out my stash of parts with which to do that. Renovating the frame, building the correct wheels, etc., which were fairly straightforward to do. However, in discussing the situation with Tony Page again during 2002, we decided to collaborate, in that I offered to pool my stash of spares with his, and to take his partly built Triumph Bandit and complete that build as a sort of learning and training exercise for myself, before then building up a separate Fury from the remainder of the parts, rather than try to attempt to get the show Fury running. And so a plan was hatched, and in 2003 I collected Tony Page's part-built Triumph Bandit SS and his stash of spare parts, and brought them to my garage to begin what appeared to be at the time a production line. And so it begins in April 2003. So just to recap, in my garage now, there's a part-built Triumph Bandit SS, which you see here, Tony Page's, as brought home. There's a stash of parts from both my hoard and Tony Page's hoard, all separated out into boxes. And in the garage at the same time, there's my show Fury, originally purchased from Vale Onslow, with no engine internals, but looking externally to be a complete bike. So as found, the Bandit SS was rather dusty, hadn't had any work done on it for a while. Part-built rolling chassis with a part-built engine with no primary case and no gearbox. And so a decision was made actually to take the rolling chassis apart and start again and repaint and rebuild from scratch. Also had the wheels rebuilt, had some of the parts re-chromed, and as you can see, time is marching on. Began to assemble various cycle parts to complete the rolling chassis, and the poor old Show Fury was still there being used for pattern parts for some of the cycle parts. Here we have in 2008 gearbox internals coming together because the engine is now back in. I didn't have to strip the engine as was. Here we have the airbox and air filter, and also the left and right rear engine plates, some of which had to be manufactured from patterns using the Show Fury. And here's the gearbox outer cover, again beginning to be built up so we can begin to assemble that gearbox. And here we are in 2009, beginning to look like a complete bike. The front end is on, bars are on. Still thinking about the gearbox, as that was quite a challenge, having to get some gears made up and finding that certain gears weren't compatible because of the different revisions. Beginning to fit the exhaust. We did have a complete exhaust already, just needed to re-chrome that and begin fitting. And then in 2012 to 13, this is where a lot of work really kicked off because we were seeing some end in sight. We were looking at the electrics. The primary drive was pretty much complete because the primary drive essentially is mostly Starfire V25. Looking at fixing the airbox and air filter, which is unique, as is the battery tray. Finally finishing the primary drive. Beginning to fit electrics. You can see the coils there in the electrical tray, similar to the twins really. And then finally getting the gearbox together and the outer covers on. And you can tell that once we get to the gasket stage and the outer cover, then things are beginning to look fairly complete. Following that, it was then time to test that the oil pump was moving oil around the engine up to the top end, and you can see it dribbling underneath the left-hand cam there. There's an internal view of the primary drive. No electric start on this one, so I didn't have that complication. And then we began to turn attentions to completing the final drive. And here we see it with the chain on, with the right-hand footrest and rear brake pedal on. And here we're getting ready really to finish, if you like, the top end of the motor, but also the electrics. And coming on to the electrics, the Street Scramblers have a junction box just behind the steering head to allow you to detach various parts. So we had that to consider. We didn't have a wiring harness. Here's the points, which are the 180 degree type, so very, very scarce. The tank and mudguards had already been painted up by Tony Page in the colour of jealous green. And here we see then the work beginning on the wiring harness, and in this case to allow for that junction box, it was a case of taking an A65 wiring harness and basically cutting it in two, and then figuring out a wiring diagram to incorporate that. So a lot of work done over a month period, and late nights and burning midnight oil to complete the wiring harness and all the connections associated with that junction box. But in the end, we managed to complete it. And then finally, it was time for the side panels and to lacquer the side panel and oil tank. So that completes a whistle-stop tour of 10 years worth of effort, actually. And by September 2013, the Bandit SS was complete and was actually running. So it's now September 2013, and we'd achieved the target of taking the bike to a classic bike track day and the vintage weekend at Cadwell Park. And here is a photo of it complete at that venue. We were really pleased with the way this turned out, and the aim was to actually reunite it with the owner, Tony Page, Captain America,
as is. And the sun was shining that weekend, and we did manage to get some really good pics, including some that were offered by a professional photographer by the name of Mark Lees, and will have reproduced some of those in other videos in the channel. Also, we took some photos of it with the long-suffering Fury, just in front of my garage at home one weekend when the sun was shining. As I say, the Fury was rated for patterns at various points for various bits and pieces. And also at this time, you'll have seen my first video on YouTube of the Bandit running. That video, which is still up on my channel, is number one. It was a pretty poor affair, really, because it was in portrait and only lasted for a minute and a half. But it was at least an initial piece of evidence showing the running Fury, and actually that was taken just before we took the bike to be reunited with Tony Page at Cadwell Park. And this is one of our favourite photos of the Bandit SS at Cadwell Park. One evening when the sun was just going down, we had some good lighting conditions, and that's when Mark Lees, the professional photographer, offered to take a few pics, and this is one of his. So a fitting end to a great week. So we still have the original Show Fury, original and unrestored. We finished one build, one down with the Triumph Bandit SS. So what was left then was to build up another Fury SS, which we attempted from the remaining stash of pooled parts. So we carried on. We'd already had certain parts manufactured along the way in duplicate with the Triumph Bandit. So we felt we had everything in place really to give this build a good go. However, there were some significant challenges on the way. One of the crankcase halves was a blank, and so we had to engage the services of a very proficient engineer, Bob Rogerson, who took on the task of machining this engine case, and also assisted them with beginning up to build up the motor. It's a pretty serious engineering job, and certainly I wasn't skilled enough to be able to undertake that. But what I could do in parallel was obviously begin to build up the rolling chassis from the frame, which we'd already had powder coated dove grey, although it's not a very good replication of that colour. We'd already had the wheels built up. I'd already managed to purchase a complete original new front set of forks and yokes, although obviously the stanchions and the springs are slightly shorter but common with the TR5 MX Triumph. So they were brand new old stock from a reputable supplier in the States. So initially I built up the rolling chassis, which wasn't too difficult, and then I managed to hunt down Bob from some of his work in the old days in Real Classic magazine, who kindly undertook to take on some of the major engine work, machining and assembly, and then following that, a lot of the work on that build has been recorded in my YouTube channel playlist for the E35 SS Fury. The Bandit and the Show Fury have had many trips out to events and shows over the last few years, and on one trip to Cadwell to the same vintage meeting towards the end of September, then my daughter took the opportunity to have her first ride on a proper bike with a clutch rather than a wind up and go BSA Junior that she had in her youth. And here she is taking it round the field at Cadwell, in some places in a little risky manner. But anyway, myself and Tony Page had to laugh at the time, because there's not many people who can say that their first proper bike that they rode was a Triumph Bandit. Here's another action shot of yours truly riding the Tony Page's Bandit round the paddock at Cadwell. And here's TP Tony Page himself riding his Fury at a demonstration lap at one of the BSA meetings. So that brings us full circle back to the scene at the beginning of this mini documentary. We've got the Triumph Bandit on loan to me still on the right, the Show Fury to the back of me, and on the left hand side on the bench is the Fury SS, which is still in the process of being completed and the subject of a playlist on this channel in its own right. Who obviously is an authority now on these models, believes that there are of the order of 25 or more surviving examples of these models, and certainly he has written plenty of articles in magazines over the intervening years, especially with respect to his own running BSA Fury and now also this Triumph Bandit SS. To shows and events in the future, and hope it will provide some insight into what might have been with respect to the ever-enduring story of the stillbirth of the Triumph Bandit and BSA Fury.